Going to take the North and never give it back.
So that's a good pick. You get the corner. I got to go bold, right? I got to go bold for this.
Yeah, she's got some nice long
Welcome
hair.
back to the Unbearable Sports Podcast. I'm your host, Brad Barron. Make sure to like and subscribe out there on YouTube. And always rate the show 5 stars everywhere that you get your podcast, especially Apple Podcast, because we continue to give away a Darnell Wright jersey once we reach 58 5-star reviews out there. We're getting so darn close. But what's going on, everybody? Today, we have an excellent show for you today because today is all about you, the people. I'll actually jump forward a little bit. For those that have seen Dark Knight Rises, this show, I got to give it back to you, the people, because for those that have listened and watched, you know that I'm big about the Bears drafting defensive line early because I think that it would make a bigger impact. But I know a lot of you out there really want offensive line early. So this is for you. This is for the offensive line lovers out there that are like, what if we just literally solidify this offensive line in the draft and we just address it early and we just freaking give a wall for Caleb Williams? So that's what today is all about. We're going to be building a wall, and the Carolina Panthers are going to pay for it, right? So we're gonna trade back. We're gonna get some picks, and we're gonna make a really good offensive line for Caleb Williams. But also, just a reminder, make sure to subscribe out there to join us on our quest for 5,000 subscribers out on YouTube before we get to the NFL draft. So let's just discuss this a little bit before we dive in to the actual mock draft. So why O-line first? Now, like I've said before, I am more of a defensive line first type of mentality because I like what we have on offensive line, and I am a Braxton Jones enjoyer. I like Braxton Jones, and I think whenever someone says, hey, let's draft a tackle, my next question is, well, what happens with Braxton Jones? So with this, what we're looking at is in this exercise and this kind of episode of what if you will, we're talking about, well, let's move Braxton Jones to guard, and then essentially you would get rid of a Nate Davis, and then you would also most likely want to get a center so that you have Tevin Jenkins, you have Darnell Wright, you have Braxton Jones, you have a left tackle for the future, and then you have a center. But like I've said, to me, I like Braxton Jones. I think that he's a good tackle, and I actually yesterday went through basically every single offensive tackle, and I like the class, but I'm not in love. I think a lot of people talk about how deep it is and how amazing it is. Some of the prospects I came away unenthused with, but really not about that. Let's get into the mock draft and let's start talking about what we might do with this overall mock draft. So let's get started with pick number 1, and no surprises here. So with pick number 1, Caleb Williams, like I said in the last episode, I'm not changing this. I'm not switching this. Caleb Williams until we go into the draft. That's ultimately what's going to happen. And so to me, I'm not changing this. I'm not going to do anything about trading back or anything like that, even though I love a good what if scenario just like this. So now we get to the number 9 pick. And yet again, I forgot to take screenshots of who was available at that time. But in this scenario, honestly, I'm just going for the gold with this. I wanted to make sure that this mock draft kind of covers a lot of bases that a lot of us fans wanted. A lot of the fans wanted. And with this, we're trading back with, I believe, the Colts in this scenario, and we're getting another first and a second. It's either the Colts or with the Saints. I can't remember, and I'm not showing my screen with the actual picks on it, but really, we're just trading back to that 14 or 15 slot and then trying to pick up a second-round pick. Now, my biggest concern with this, especially if the Bears were going to go with offensive line, is which offensive lineman do they want? Do they want a Fontenot out of Washington, who, to me, I think that he's more of a guard than a tackle. When I was watching the tape, he's got really long arms, but you see him out there, you're like, that is a tiny, tiny tackle that is out there. So I think he's more of a guard, and that's where I'm really looking at like an Olu Fashanu, who is a true left tackle, and I think he might go a little bit before 14 or 15. But yet again, I've seen mock drafts where people say, well, you got a Fawanga who's climbing up a lot of boards. A lot of people like Mims out of Georgia, who's just this gigantic right tackle. There's a lot of right tackles that could potentially shift over. So ultimately, we trade back, and what do we do with that draft pick? We ultimately walk away with Olu Fashanu, left tackle out of Penn State, junior, 6'6", 312. And ultimately, when I was doing the scouting report, his strength is pass blocking, but his weakness is run blocking. This was a player that was supposed to go number one. Remember when we had the number one pick and the debate was, do we go Olu Fashanu or Marvin Harrison Jr. at the very, very beginning when we're like, all right, we have the first pick in the draft. What do we do with it? Olu was seen as this blue chip player and has just gone down boards. Now he's the number 14 consensus player. Before, he was kind of all the way up at 3. It was basically Caleb Williams, or it's like Caleb Williams, Drake May, Marvin Harrison Jr., then Olu. And he's dropped 10 spots. And why is that? And the biggest reason is because of his run blocking. But when it comes down to pass blocking, this guy has never given up a sack. He's just an absolute elite pass blocker. And when you watch the tape, he's out on his own island consistently. They just don't even try and help him. They just go, okay, Olu's got that side. Let's just leave him there. And that's the biggest reason why, if you're going to bring in a Caleb Williams, Olu would be that guy that at the left tackle position I really like. Now, I know some people are saying, what about Fuanga? Talise Fuanga is the right tackle out of Oregon State. I think he could potentially switch to left tackle, and a lot of times it's kind of been dispelled. If you are a right tackle, you can switch to left tackle when you're early on in your career. And the big reason is because you haven't gotten used to the game yet at the NFL level. So I actually like Fuanga better. He's my tackle too. I just think that he's gone before Fashanu because I loved Talise Fuanga's tape. I put him all the way up to elite. I absolutely loved his tape. Fashanu, tackle number 3, but overall very, very good pass blocker. Now, yet again, why did he move down? Well, if you look at this, 12.9% negative play rate. He just makes a lot of mistakes out there in the running game. And I know some Bears fans that are big Olu fans are going to cringe at this, but I couldn't help but think about Charles Leno. He reminded me a lot of Charles Leno's game a little bit, where I think obviously he's a better pass protector than Charles Leno, but Charles Leno was known for not being a good run blocker. When you run to his side, he's not moving people. He's not shifting people over. That's my biggest downside about Olu Fashanu, where I think maybe he might not be the Bears' tackle of choice. It just depends on what Shane Waldron wants to do with this offensive line. So I know that some people don't like that, but to me, that was my biggest fear with him when watching tape. I don't see a gigantic people mover, and it just seems like he makes some of those mistakes that I saw Charles Leno make. That's where I was just getting kind of flashbacks to some Charles Leno pieces where he's not necessarily the lead blocker you want at that left tackle position. But ultimately, this guy is a very, very good athlete, 9.59 RAS score, just phenomenal pass blocker, and also former teammate of Caleb Williams. So how would you grade this? How would you grade it if the Bears were to go with Olu Fashanu? We're drafting him at that 14 or 15 type of a range. And to be honest, I don't mind this. Yet again, I like Braxton Jones. I think that I like Braxton Jones, what he brings in the run game. And that's my biggest question with Fashanu. And that's where, with Chris Morgan, does Chris Morgan feel like he can coach that into Fashanu? Because if he can, then this would be a home run of a pick. He's got all the elite athleticism that you want, and just he knows how to block. He knows how to pass block. So could be an absolute home run of a pick. But like we said, we're going to be moving people around. Also, I have this in the draft. After this pick, Bears trade away Larry Borum because we already have some tackles. We trade away Larry Borum for a 7th round pick to the Kansas City Chiefs. So what happens to our 2nd round pick now that we picked up from trading back? So yet again, more in that middle of the 2nd round. And this person could potentially drop due to just concerns about his size, but also because the center position is someone that people will value differently. Center is considered a low value position, and that's where you might see this person also drop a little bit. And of course, I'm talking about Zach Frazier. Bears pick up Zach Frazier with the second pick, with their second round pick. So ultimately, when you're trading back, you get a tackle, you get a center, and now your offensive line, you feel solidified with this. So offensive line fans out there, how are you feeling about this? And I know some might say, well, what about JPJ? JPJ is going in the first, even though I saw some ESPN reports out there that he might drop a little bit. But still, even if he drops, I think he's going to get swooped up in the early day 2. So I think ultimately Bears, not great with that scenario. But also, if anyone's out there saying, why don't you go with the tackle in the second round? Yet again, I was not really impressed with too many of these tackle prospects. And I think if you're getting them in the middle of the second round, a lot of those are projects that you don't necessarily want to start day 1, but could start in maybe a couple of years. I saw a lot of projects out there at the tackle position. But Zach Frazier, I digress. 6'2", 313, junior out of West Virginia, and really ultimately, it's his football IQ that makes him a stud out there. He's my center too. He is the 43 overall prospect on the consensus big board, the second center prospect that's out there. But the biggest weakness, yet again, I talked about his size. He's a little bit shorter, and he's really kind of built like a bowling ball, stubby arms, and that's why I do have some concerns with him, and that's why he's not my center. One, I just think that he's a very smart, instinctual player. He knows how to block people. He just knows where to be, and just a very intelligent, experienced center. And ultimately, that's what you want out of the center position. Now, Coleman Shelton could still potentially start because the Bears have talked about the importance of having an experienced center with a rookie quarterback, but Zach Frazier could just be waiting in the wings, or if anything goes wrong with Shelton, essentially take his turn. But also, some of the downsides, like I said, below the 10th percentile in arm length and height, ultimately, he is just a pure center. So that's what you can kind of consider with him, just a pure center prospect. But overall, a very good player that you can kind of essentially build around as a center. So you feel kind of good, high floor player that should just be a good player for you from years to come. So now the offensive line is fixed. Now what? Now what do we do? And ultimately what I end up doing later on, because we have Fashanu, we have Frazier. With the third round pick, I traded back. There just wasn't a lot of good prospects that I liked out there because kind of eyeing up, is there any defensive linemen? Are there any wide receivers? And ultimately, the way that the board fell just wasn't really great for me. Also, I can now see this too. We traded back with the Saints. So the Saints always love to trade up and try and get their specific player. Now, a lot of people say their specific player might actually be Olufashanu. So if there's a specific offensive tackle, maybe it's a Fawanga that they ultimately want to try and grab. That could be the play there. But ultimately, Bears trading the number 9 pick for 14 and 45. But then Bears trade with the 49ers, who have a whole bunch of different draft capital and compensatory picks. Bears trade pick 75 for pick 94. So we go pretty darn late at the bottom of the third round for pick 124, 135, and a fourth rounder the next season. And I believe the acceptance rate on that was like about 60%. So it's pretty good, all things considered. So what the Bears ultimately end up doing there is we need to address defensive line. Brendan Rice was not on the board, and a handful of other wide receivers. A lot of those were off. Brendan Rice literally went one pick before, but that's the way that the cookie crumbles. Ultimately, we walk away with Michael Hall Jr., the defensive tackle out of Ohio State. And this player dominated at the Senior Bowl. This person is someone that I think that the Bears would really, really like. The big thing that gets me a giant question mark on him is I feel like he is a big boom or bust type of a prospect. And you look at his athletic testing, 9.56 RAS score. He's 6'2", 299. He at least bulked up a little bit. But 4.75 40-yard dash, 1.65 10-yard split. That's 9.92 grade for his 40-yard dash and a 9.76 in 10-yard split. It's just, he's an incredible, incredible athlete that is a pure 3 technique. But like I said, very boom or bust. And the Bears, they want to develop players. They want to develop someone who can dominate. 18.3% pass rush win rate, very quick-footed. It's difficult to teach that first step quickness. And I think ultimately this is a good project that the Bears might want to take on. And yet again, this is why I like to go defensive line early, because I think when you go later on, if you get a project, you get someone like a Michael Hall who only has 1.5 sacks last year, but 22 hurries isn't terrible, especially coming off of the interior. But someone that the Bears might want to pick up at that defensive tackle position. So later on, though, in the draft, we ultimately just have a couple different 4th-round picks. And actually, I'm going to pull up my draft sheet just so I know what exact draft picks I actually have. So if I'm looking at these, let me just pull these up. So down in the 4th round, there was a handful of different picks that we could select, but ultimately I'm going with one of my favorite players at pick 122. You've already heard me talk about him, Malik Washington, wide receiver out of Virginia, the one-year wonder, just a very smart player, knows where to be, a little bit smaller, 5'8", 194, but he at least has some pretty darn good size for just a player his stature. Him being that short, he at least has some meat on the bones, but to me gives you some good quickness and good smarts at the slot position. Yet again, I've said this before, I don't love the idea of getting slot players because Keenan Allen is more of a slot, in my opinion, now at his older age. But I think ultimately with Malik Washington being there, I'd rather just take the good wide receiver and then try and play a Keenan Allen more so on the outside position and then have a Malik Washington kind of duke it out at that more interior type of play. So if we continue on, Malik Washington and our next pick, yet again, another 4th-round selection, and ultimately we come away with tight end Ben Sinnott, who Ben Sinnott, redshirt junior out of Kansas State, 6'4", 250, my tight end 4 on my board. And we haven't talked much about Ben, but ultimately Kansas State tight end, he can play everywhere. He can play the fullback position. He can play slot. He can play inline. He can play anywhere you want. He has incredible athleticism, and he put that on display at the combine. 9.72 RAS score. Now he's a little short, 6'3" and 7, 6'3.7, which isn't bad, but it's kind of middling a little bit. But yet again, tight ends are getting a little bit shorter. But you look at his speed, 4.68 as the 40-yard dash, 1.62, 10-yard split, 40-inch vertical. This guy has elite explosive numbers, elite agility numbers, and great speed numbers. This guy is phenomenal. I really, really enjoy his tape, and kind of reminds me a little bit of Sam Laporta. He can break tackles. He's just a very fearsome player. Otherwise, you can just insert any one of those like utility fullback / tight end types of players. The use check or whoever it might be. That's kind of what type of a player he is. Now, the biggest question I do have, and the reason why he's not higher, is he does lack a lot of length. His arms are a little short, and ultimately, him being a shorter stature player with shorter arms, you kind of have some questions with the blocking. Is he going to be able to truly latch on to some of these lanky players that play out on the edge? So Ben Sinnott, just a player that I truly like at that tight end position that the Bears get out in the 4th round. So I believe that we're at the 5th rounders. It's not showing my actual draft class, so I'm just going to be going off of it. I know that I had a handful of other picks out there. My 5th round pick, I'm going with Taj Washington, USC wide receiver. I wanted to go wide receiver just to like I said, I love to double up, and especially since we have, I think wide receiver too. If you double up at wide receiver and if you draft wide receivers later, because I know some people say, what about edge? A lot of these defensive ends that are in these later portions of the draft, I just don't see them as contributors for the Bears this year or potentially in the future. I'm not high on a lot of the players like Muhammad Kamara, not a big fan of his. So ultimately, we're trying to get some impact players, bring in someone that Caleb Williams knows with a Taj Washington. Now he's 5'10", 174, reminds me a lot of Jakeem Grant from the Bears. He's a small player. short arms, short hands. That's his biggest downfall, is just that overall catch radius out of him. Also, yet again, another slot player. So you can have these players more inside of that slot type of a role. Keenan Allen on the outside, as well as a DJ Moore on the outside. And then these rookies are more of those inline players or more slot players. And you'll have some 2 tight end sets. They can come in. But really, both Washingtons that we're drafting, these are big play-making receivers. And Taj Washington, 59 receptions, 1,062 yards, and 8 touchdowns. Yes, he's a little bit shorter, but he also has very strong hands. If you put the ball around him, he will come down with the catch. 1.7% drop rate, which is phenomenally good, and then a 66.7% contested catch rate, which is also really good. 80.4 grade versus man, and also was in the 98th percentile against zone. So I believe that was separation versus zone coverage. So he's someone that can find the hole in the zone, similar to our other Washington, Malik Washington, that we just got. Players that can make the quarterback's job easy. But also, too, what I love about Taj Washington, he's a very good returner. He can do kick returns. He can do punt returns. So Velus Jones, you don't have to chance that with his variability out there. So Taj Washington gives you someone with the new kickoff rules that you can trust back there to potentially house that ball. So the only thing that's kind of negative with Taj Washington, besides his size, though, didn't test great at the combine. A 4.58 40-yard dash is not good, even though it's middle of the pack. You expect something from a player that is only 174 pounds. 35-inch vertical isn't great, but it's solid. I think just overall, that's why he's in the 5th rounds, in the 6th rounds, just a later prospect that you can pick up that has the chemistry with a Caleb Williams. Plus 2, he is a smart player, understands the holes in the zone. That's why I like him a little bit later as a late round flyer at the wide receiver position. So next, this is when we get to our 7th round pick that we got from Larry Borum. Ultimately, I'm not going to talk about this much. This was just a very Ryan Poles pick. There wasn't a lot of players there, and I was like, you know what? We've been talking to a lot of cornerbacks. Ultimately, the Bears wind up with Marcellus Dial, cornerback out of South Carolina, just because it does seem like the Bears are looking at corner just to add another player to the roster. So let's look at this roster. And now I can actually see where we were making some of these picks. So if we look at this first pick in the draft, we go with Caleb Williams. 14th pick, we walk away with left tackle Olu Fashanu. Then at pick 45, we walk away with Zach Frazier, center out of West Virginia. Then we trade back and pick up another 4th round pick for next year from the 49ers, but ultimately walk away with Michael Hall Jr., the quick defensive tackle out of Ohio State. Then we get, it's 3 4th round picks that we had. We walk away with Malik Washington, wide receiver out of Virginia at pick 122. At 124, we come away with my tight end 4 and overall consensus tight end 5, Ben Sinnott out of Kansas State. Then at pick 135, we come away with Taj Washington. So we're kind of doubling up at the slot receiver. I don't necessarily love that, but then ultimately round out with at 221, round out with just a cornerback just to add some cornerback depth. So what do we think of this so far? Because overall, yet again, I wanted to kind of test this out to see what I think about this, and I'm not necessarily in love with it. I'll be honest with you. And I know that some people might be saying, well, why didn't we go with the defensive lineman? Why didn't we go with this? Well, that's the way the board falls when you invest first with offensive line. That's just my big fear with it, and why I'm not necessarily a big fan of going with the offensive line that early or anything like that. So actually, that brings up a good point, because if we have this, we need a defensive lineman. And then that comes in with the free agent class. And yet again, what we've talked about, kind of why I prioritize defensive tackle, besides just I think the Bears might like Michael Hall with him doing very, the Bears like those project defensive tackles. So that's why I think that they've tried to would go after him. But also when you look at defensive ends, it's a lot deeper. Like I've said a million times on this show before, defensive ends, you can still sign someone to contribute. So there's still Calais Campbell, Carl Lawson, Mike Dana, Kyle Van Noy, Bud Dupree, Shaq Lawson, which would be interesting, a former Buffalo Bill, Yannick Ngakoue, Jerry Hughes would also be interesting, another former Buffalo Bill, Marcus Golden, Rasheem Green, Charles Harris, Emmanuel Ogbah, Justin Houston, Bruce Irvin. So still a handful of defensive ends. And just for the sake of this exercise, I'm picking one up because I've said this before. I think that the Bears purposely are not signing anybody because they want to see how the board falls. And then if they're not able to get a defensive end, or if they're not able to get a defensive tackle, or if they're not able to get a wide receiver, they'll pick someone up in free agency. You're not going to be getting amazing production out of someone, but I think ultimately they might do something like that. And for me, I come away with Calais Campbell at the defensive end / defensive tackle spot. I think the Bears ultimately will like him because they like defensive linemen that can anchor and really just solidify that running game. Calais Campbell, 6'8", 282. He's a big man. And he's typically, he used to always play more of that outside type of a role or inside type of a role. But now recently with Atlanta, majority of his snaps have played at that defensive end spot. So could be a very good pickup, even though he is 37 years old. Just someone that can contribute to your defensive line. Because yet again, you're doing rotational defensive linemen. Calais Campbell is not the future, but he's someone that can win you games and make this defensive front a lot better. So let's look at this roster. And overall, like I mentioned, not necessarily in love with it. When you look at the front, though, the front is something that you can get excited about. Olu Fashanu at your left tackle, Braxton Jones moving over to left guard, Shelton as your center with Zach Frazier as that backup, where then you're hoping that Frazier can play himself into a starting role. Tevin Jenkins at going back to the right guard position, and then Darnell Wright as your right tackle of the future. Then yet again, wide receivers, Taj Washington and Malik Washington, I think would more so play the slot, and then you would move Keenan Allen over to the outside receiver position. But I still don't hate what you have out there. And then you're hoping that a Tyler Scott or even like a Colin Johnson could play more of that outside receiver role for you as the backups for a Keenan Allen. And then next, what you have out there, and then Ben Sinnott being your backup tight end. Kari Blasingame still have him on the roster, Gerald Everett and Cole Kmet at tight end, with obviously Caleb Williams being your quarterback. But then on the defensive side of the ball, you're talking about like Dial that we just added. He's just going to be a backup corner. He's a 7th round player. And typically what the Bears like to do is they like to go off the board and just select whoever they want. So ultimately he's going to be your backup corner. But really on the defense, we didn't add anything except for Michael Hall being that kind of 4th rotational defensive tackle. And what I think your defensive tackle lines would look like is Javon Dexter and Andrew Billings as the starters, and then Michael Hall and Zach Pickens being those backups, with Hall exclusively being more that 3 technique, and Zach Pickens still kind of continuing that role as your 1 technique on that defensive line. But then you have your defensive ends, Walker and Sweat as your starters, Campbell as the backup. Honestly, Campbell might even just be the starter at that point. I like Campbell more than Walker, but then you have Jake Martin or Dominique Robinson as those backups. So, like I said, let me know what you think, because was this a smart choice? And I really want to know from you, the people, the people that love offensive line, is this what you want? Is this, like, do you see this and you go, yes, this is exactly what we need? Because I think it's fun, the idea that what I like about this, right, to be objective about this, what I like about this solution, this is the reason why I wanted to go through it. What I like about it is it gives you your offensive line for the future around your franchise quarterback, Caleb Williams. It might not pay dividends this year, but a year or two down the road, right? You can sign Tevin Jenkins. You can sign Tevin Jenkins because he's going to be a free agent next offseason. You re-sign him. Now you have Darnell Wright. You have Olu Fashanu as your tackles. Braxton Jones, who has been very good. Yet again, I'm a big Braxton Jones fan. And then you have a Tevin Jenkins. And then you also have Zach Frazier up in the middle. So you have that unit that you can, in theory, grow everyone around together. And also what I do like about this as well is Nate Davis. I think that we're going to learn a lot about Nate Davis. I think they have mini camp on the 15th. that they're going to be able to bring people in, we'll know more about Nate Davis's health and is he back in shape? Because I think if he's not in shape, then yes, then the Bears should definitely be looking at how can we replace him? How can we put someone in this offensive line? And then this makes it a lot easier. The Bears also have a lot of cap space still available. Not like, you can just sign someone to a 10-year, $10 million deal anytime soon, but you can at least make, if the Nate Davis signing turns out to be a huge mistake and he's still looks like the same Nate Davis we saw last year, you can at least move on from that and take minimal losses. You can cut him pre-June 1st so that you just eat all the dead salary cap so we're not pushing it out into the future. So just for anyone that looks out there on like the spot racks and everything else, if you do a post-June 1st designation, you kick more of that salary into the future. I think ultimately if the Bears wanted to move on from him, just eat it right now. Just get it done with so that you can then sign people in the future. I think ultimately that's what the Bears would end up doing. But like I said, let me know what you think down below. And if you enjoyed this, make sure to like and subscribe out there on YouTube. We'll be live tomorrow at 7:30 to break down. I think we're going to do a mock draft. I still got to break this down. We might do a fan mock draft. So hope to see you all there. Make sure to like and subscribe. Unbearable Sports Podcast. We are out.
Yeah, she's got some nice long hair, and you know that she's a